I was walking my daughter home when she suddenly froze and pointed to the bench. A young woman lay curled beneath the snow, lips turning blue, breath barely visible. In that moment, I knew this wasn't something we could just walk past. The city seemed hushed under winter's touch, as though every sound had been softened by the steady curtain of snow. Street lamps glowed warmly in the cold, their light catching each drifting flake and scattering it like sparks from some unseen fire. James Walker pulled his wool coat tighter across his chest, the familiar tug of fabric against his broad shoulders reminding him of the long walk home that he and Emma had come to know so well. His gloved hand held hers, small and warm, swinging between them with the rhythm of a child's boundless energy. Emma, bundled in her pink winter coat, tilted her face to the sky, letting the delicate flakes settle on her cheeks. Her knitted white hat slipped slightly to the side, revealing a few golden curls that framed her rosy face. She hummed as she skipped beside her father, her little boots crunching in the snow. James felt a smile tug at his lips. Every Friday evening for the past 2 years had ended this way, with the two of them returning from dinner at their favorite downtown restaurant. It had become their ritual after Sarah's passing, a way to honor the joy she had brought into their lives, and to remind themselves that even in loss, love could still be celebrated. "Daddy, look how pretty the snow is," Emma said suddenly, tugging at his hand so that he'd look up too. Her voice carried a mix of awe and certainty, as though she'd just uncovered some secret truth about the world. "It looks like tiny stars falling from the sky." James followed her gaze. The snow did look like stars, falling not from galaxies, but from heaven itself. For a moment, he allowed himself to wonder if Sarah might be sending these stars down for them, reminding them she was still near. He gave Emma's hand a gentle squeeze. "You're absolutely right, sweetheart. Tonight does look magical." Emma grinned, her breath forming soft clouds in the cold air. She kicked at the snow, leaving a trail of uneven footprints behind her, and then she leaned close against his side. "Mommy used to say stars were wishes, didn't she?" James swallowed, the familiar ache blooming in his chest. "She did," he said softly. "And I think she'd tell you that every snowflake tonight is a wish, too." Emma's eyes sparkled. "Then I'll make lots of wishes." They walked on, the city quiet around them except for the muffled sound of tires crunching on distant roads. The park where James often brought Emma on warmer days was coming into view, its trees etched in white and its benches wearing soft blankets of snow. James felt peace in that moment, a rare calm that seemed to shield them from everything beyond this simple walk. The stress of work, the grief that sometimes returned without warning, the questions about raising a child alone. For now, it was only father, daughter, and winter's quiet blessing. The iron gates of the neighborhood park loomed ahead, dusted white like something out of a painting. James had walked this path hundreds of times with Emma, but tonight her hand tugged at his sleeve before they even reached the entrance. He looked down to see her suddenly still, her wide eyes focused on something just beyond the glow of the lamppost. "Daddy," she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. "Why is that lady sleeping there?" James followed her gaze. On the nearest bench, a shape was curled up beneath a thin blanket, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of shallow breaths. Snow had already started to collect on the edges of the fabric. A strand of blonde hair peeked out from under a faded red scarf, catching the light in a way that made the woman seem both fragile and exposed. Even from a distance, James could tell she was trembling. His first instinct was to move Emma along, to shield her from the sight. Homelessness was something he had tried to explain before, carefully, in terms a 6-year-old might understand. But this was no longer a distant conversation. This was real, immediate, human. Emma clutched his coat tighter, her eyes not leaving the figure on the bench. "Isn't she cold?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of concern that cut through James more sharply than the winter air. Her innocence was unfiltered, untouched by the cynicism that so often governed adults' responses. For her, the woman was not a stranger, not a burden. She was simply a person in need. James inhaled slowly. Over the years, he had grown accustomed to passing people in similar circumstances. A quick donation, a polite nod, and he'd move on. But something about Emma's question, and the smallness of her hand gripping his, made him pause. He thought of Sarah, how she would have knelt by the bench without hesitation, how she had always insisted that kindness wasn't something to be calculated, but something to be lived. She must be very cold, Emma said again, firmer this time, as though she couldn't quite understand why they were still standing and not already helping. Mommy always told me we should help people when they need it. Her words sank deep. James felt his chest tighten. He looked at Emma, then back at the fragile figure on the bench. Snow was falling faster now, settling into the folds of the blanket. He could see the woman's lips, faintly tinged blue. "You're right, sweetheart," he said finally, his voice low. "We can't just leave her here." Emma nodded as though she had been waiting for him to catch up with her heart. She let go of his sleeve and took a small step toward the bench, her boots crunching in the snow. James followed close behind, his protective instincts on high alert, but tempered by the undeniable truth that this moment mattered, not just for the woman shivering alone, but for the little girl who was watching to see what kind of man her father truly was. As they drew near, the silence of the park pressed around them, broken only by the faint rustle of branches overhead. James saw the woman's shoulders move slightly beneath the thin blanket, a fragile effort to keep warm. Emma's voice was soft, but filled with urgency. "Daddy, we have to ask if she's okay." James nodded, his own heart heavier now, aware that what they were about to do would ripple into their lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. James slowed his steps as they reached the bench, careful not to startle the woman. Up close, the reality was even harsher. Her blanket was nothing more than a threadbare scrap, hardly enough to shield against the biting cold. Snow clung to the edges of her worn coat, and her hands, thin and pale, were pulled tightly against her chest. For a moment, James hesitated, torn between the instinct to help and the fear of crossing into someone's private pain uninvited. "Excuse me, miss," he said gently, his voice low but steady. "Are you all right?" The woman stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Confusion clouded her expression, followed swiftly by fear. She sat up quickly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, and clutched it back around herself as if it were the last shield she possessed. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her words strained from the cold. Her voice was quiet, frayed at the edges, but still carried a note of dignity. "I wasn't bothering anyone. I'll move along." James raised a hand in a calming gesture. "Please, don't apologize. We're not asking you to leave. We just want to make sure you're safe." Emma stepped closer, her little boots crunching in the snow. Her small face was lit with unguarded concern, eyes wide and sincere. "Are you hungry, lady? My daddy and I just had dinner, and they had so much food at the restaurant." The woman blinked, as though the kindness in Emma's words was something foreign, unexpected. She looked from Emma to James, her lips parting slightly as if to refuse, but her eyes betrayed the exhaustion behind her hesitation. "That's very sweet of you," she said finally, her voice catching. "But I don't want to be any trouble." Emma tilted her head, studying her with childlike directness. "What's your name?" The woman hesitated, her shoulders curling inward as though even her name might cost too much to give. I'm Rachel," she said softly. Emma's face brightened instantly. "I'm Emma, and this is my daddy, James." She turned quickly to her father, her voice rising with urgency. "Daddy, can Rachel come home with us? She looks really cold, and our house is warm." James felt his heart skip at the boldness of his daughter's suggestion. He looked at Rachel more closely. In the glow of the lamppost, her face was drawn but delicate, her eyes a pale blue that seemed burdened with both pride and fear. She looked down quickly, unable to meet his gaze for long, as though ashamed of her own need. "I couldn't impose," Rachel whispered, shaking her head. "You don't even know me." Emma frowned, confused by the refusal. She reached for her father's hand and pressed it against her mitten. "But we know you're cold," she said simply, her voice as firm as any truth could be. "That's enough, isn't it, Daddy?" James studied Rachel, the quiet shiver of her shoulders beneath the thin fabric, the faint tremor in her voice. And then he looked at Emma, her eyes full of belief, as though kindness were the most natural choice in the world. He remembered Sarah's lessons, the way she had taught Emma to measure people not by their circumstances, but by their humanity. James drew in a breath, his decision made. "Rachel," he said carefully, his tone respectful, "we may not know each other yet, but if you'd like, you're welcome to come to our house tonight. You can get warm, have a hot meal, and stay until the weather improves." Rachel's eyes welled with sudden tears, catching the lamplight as they fell. She shook her head, her voice breaking. I, I don't deserve that kindness. James was about to respond, but Emma's soft voice came first, firm and innocent. Everyone deserves kindness. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that came when walls began to crack, when the possibility of trust appeared in the smallest of openings. For a long moment, Rachel sat silently on the bench, clutching her thin blanket as though it were a shield. The snowflakes drifted down around them, some settling in her hair until they melted against the faint warmth of her skin. James could see the battle in her eyes, gratitude fighting against fear, hope against shame. I can't, she whispered, shaking her head as if trying to convince herself as much as them. I'd only cause trouble. People don't just take strangers home. James crouched slightly so that his gaze met hers, steady and without judgment. You wouldn't be causing trouble, he said quietly. You'd be safe. That's what matters tonight. Emma tugged at Rachel's sleeve with her mitten, her little face earnest. Our house is big. You could have the guest room, and I can make you hot chocolate. I always put in extra marshmallows. Rachel let out a faint laugh, but it broke into a cough almost immediately. She pulled the blanket tighter, looking down at the snow beneath her boots. It sounds wonderful, but kindness like that doesn't come for free. I don't want to owe anyone. James felt a pang at her words. He'd heard tones like that before, in business meetings, in negotiations, people weary of hidden strings, of promises that turned to debts. But in Rachel's voice, there was no calculation, only exhaustion and fear. There's nothing to owe, he said firmly. Sometimes people just need help. That's all. Rachel's lips trembled. She looked toward Emma, who was nodding as though her father had just spoken a truth written in stone. See, Emma said softly, Daddy always means what he says. The child's confidence seemed to press where logic could not. Rachel's eyes grew wet again, and she brushed quickly at the tears, embarrassed. I don't want to cry, she murmured. It feels weak. It's not weak, James replied gently. It's human, and I promise, you don't have to go through this night alone. The park around them was quiet, but James felt the weight of the decision hovering in the air. He could almost hear Sarah's voice in the back of his mind, urging him to act with compassion, reminding him that Emma was watching, learning what it meant to live by the values her mother had cherished. Rachel exhaled slowly, her breath a thin cloud. At last, she gave the smallest nod. If you're sure, I'll come. Emma beamed, clapping her hands together. Yay, Daddy, Rachel's coming home with us. James helped Rachel to her feet. She was lighter than he expected, her steps unsteady at first. Without hesitation, Emma slipped her mittened hand into Rachel's, as naturally as if they had known each other forever. The three of them began walking back toward the house. At first, the silence was fragile, uncertain, but Emma quickly filled it with chatter about her school projects, her favorite books, and the snowman she wanted to build that weekend. Rachel listened quietly, her expression softening with each word, as though the warmth of a child's voice was beginning to thaw something frozen deep inside her. James glanced at Rachel as they walked beneath the lamplights. She kept her gaze lowered, but every now and then she lifted her eyes to Emma and smiled faintly, the kind of smile that revealed both weariness and longing. James thought of how unexpected life could be, how a simple walk home could open a door neither he nor Emma had known they needed. By the time they reached James's house, the cold had crept into every layer of clothing. Their boots left damp trails on the wooden porch as James unlocked the door and pushed it open to reveal the warm glow inside. Rachel hesitated on the threshold, her eyes darting nervously from the polished wood floors to the family photographs on the wall. It's beautiful, she whispered, almost as if she were afraid her voice might shatter the comfort of the place. It's home, James said simply. He helped her step inside, and Emma hurried to close the door behind them, shutting out the biting wind. At once, the stillness of the house embraced them, carrying the faint scent of pine from the Christmas wreath still hanging in the hallway. James led Rachel toward the guest room, a space he had kept tidy though rarely used. He set fresh towels on the bed, pulled warm clothes from the wardrobe, soft sweaters and sweatpants he thought might fit, and left them folded neatly. Rachel lingered near the doorway, her hands twisting the edge of her scarf. I don't know how to thank you, she said, her voice breaking with fatigue. It feels strange, being somewhere safe after so long. You don't need to thank us, James replied gently. Rest, take a shower if you'd like, and come to the living room when you're ready. Rachel nodded but didn't move for a moment, as though her body didn't trust her mind to believe safety was real. Finally, she stepped inside, her shoulders sagging with both relief and the unfamiliar weight of comfort. Meanwhile, Emma busied herself in the kitchen, standing on her stool to reach the cocoa mix. Daddy, I'm making 3 cups, she announced proudly. With extra marshmallows, like I promised. James watched her pour the milk carefully, her little tongue poking out in concentration. He felt something stir in him, a warmth not just from the house, but from the sense that this night, unusual as it was, mattered deeply. When Rachel rejoined them a while later, she looked almost unrecognizable, clean and wrapped in borrowed clothes. Her damp hair brushed over her shoulders. She carried herself with quiet uncertainty. Yet the simple act of being warm and cared for had softened the lines of exhaustion on her face. Emma darted over, handing her a steaming mug. See? Just like I said. Lots of marshmallows. Rachel accepted it with trembling hands. She inhaled the sweet steam, and for the first time that evening, a genuine smile flickered across her lips. It's perfect, she whispered, as though the cocoa were more than a drink. It was a reminder of belonging. They gathered in the living room, the fire crackling gently in the hearth. Emma curled on the rug with her mug, humming softly. James settled into his chair, his eyes occasionally flicking to Rachel, studying the way she stared into the flames. There was a silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of people adjusting to a new rhythm, of strangers taking the first tentative steps toward trust. Emma, never content with quiet for long, broke the spell. Daddy, can Rachel stay for Christmas? She could help me make cookies. James chuckled softly, though his gaze remained on Rachel, waiting for her reaction. She didn't laugh. Her expression tightened, as though the idea of being included in something so ordinary felt almost unbearable. That's very kind, she said, her voice low. But I don't want to take more than I should. James leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. Rachel, you're not taking. Tonight, you're part of this house. That's all. Her eyes glistened at the words, but she nodded and wrapped her hands more tightly around the mug. For the first time in what must have been weeks, she allowed herself to lean back against a sofa cushion, the heat of the fire seeping into her bones. Emma reached out her small hand and rested it on Rachel's arm. See? It's better already. And for the first time, Rachel seemed to believe her. The fire had burned lower, glowing embers casting the living room in a softer, more intimate light. Emma had curled up with a blanket on the rug, her head nodding sleepily against a pillow, though her stubborn little hands still clutched the empty cocoa mug as though it were treasure. James watched his daughter's steady breathing, the rise and fall of her chest, before turning his attention back to Rachel. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her posture tense despite the warmth of the room. For a long while she stared into the fire as though gathering courage. Finally, she drew in a shaky breath. I should explain, she said quietly, why I was out there. Why I don't have anywhere else to go. You don't owe me an explanation, James said gently. You're safe here. That's enough for tonight. Rachel's eyes flicked to his, then away. Safe feels temporary when you've lost it before. And if I don't tell you, you'll only wonder. She folded her hands together, knuckles white. I had a job. A decent one, really. Marketing assistant for a firm downtown. I thought I was on my way to something stable. Then the company downsized, and I was one of the first to go. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. I tried to stay afloat. Rent, bills, groceries, it all adds up so fast when you don't have income. At first, I stayed with friends. Then they started closing doors. Everyone has their limits. Eventually, I ran out of couches to sleep on. Shelters were the next option, but in winter, they fill up before you can even get your name on the list. So I ended up where you found me. She looked down at the mug still in her hands, the cocoa long gone but the warmth clinging faintly. I have a degree. I studied communications. I've applied to dozens of jobs, sent out resume after resume, but it's hard to get an interview when you don't have a permanent address. Employers notice. They always notice. James listened in silence, his brow furrowing as the weight of her story settled over him. He thought of how easily fortunes could shift, how many people walked the same city streets, outwardly composed, while a single setback unraveled everything behind closed doors. "You kept trying," he said finally. "That matters. It tells me more about you than the rest." Rachel let out a hollow laugh. "Trying doesn't pay for a roof." James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His tone shifted, quiet but certain. "I run a marketing firm. We've been searching for someone with your background. Honestly, half the resumes I've seen in the last month didn't carry half the determination I hear in your voice right now. If you're willing, I'd like you to come in and meet my team." Rachel blinked, as though she hadn't heard him correctly. "Are you serious?" James nodded. "Completely." Emma stirred on the rug, half asleep, but still awake enough to mumble, "Daddy always means what he says." Her voice was drowsy, but the conviction in it made Rachel's throat tighten. Tears welled in her eyes again, and this time she didn't try to hide them. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "No one has offered me a chance like that. Not in months." "Then let this be the first step," James said. "You don't have to figure out everything tonight. Just know that tomorrow can look different." Rachel exhaled, her shoulders slumping with something that resembled relief. She nodded slowly, as if daring to believe that possibility could exist. For the first time since she had walked into the house, James saw her face soften, not in resignation, but in hope. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm that surprised Rachel. What had begun as a desperate acceptance of shelter slowly became the first steps of reclaiming her life. The guest room, once unfamiliar and almost too comfortable to trust, turned into a sanctuary where she could finally rest without fear of being woken by cold wind or the shuffle of strangers. James was deliberate about giving her space. He didn't hover, didn't press her with questions, but his quiet steadiness was always there. A fresh set of towels folded outside her door, a knock before breakfast with the smell of coffee drifting through the house. Emma, on the other hand, wasted no time in claiming Rachel as part of her world. She would sit at the kitchen table, chattering about her classmates, her drawings, or the storybook she wanted Rachel to read aloud. "You do the voices better than Daddy," Emma declared one night, eyes sparkling with mischief. Rachel laughed softly, a sound that came more easily each day. "Don't tell him that. He might get jealous." James, overhearing from the hallway, only smiled to himself. He could see the change happening, not just in Rachel, but in Emma too. His daughter, who had lived with a quiet absence since Sarah's passing, seemed lighter now, more animated. There was something about Rachel's presence, gentle but resilient, that filled spaces he hadn't even realized were empty. Within the week, Rachel stood in front of James's office building, her nerves almost undoing her resolve. She had borrowed a blazer from the wardrobe of clothes James kept from years past, one that hung a little loosely but gave her the shape of professionalism she feared she had lost. When she walked into the conference room, James's team greeted her politely, though curiosity lingered in their eyes. But it didn't take long for Rachel to silence doubts. She spoke with clarity, explaining how she had handled campaigns in her previous job, how she had managed deadlines under pressure, how she had found creative ways to stretch small budgets into meaningful results. By the time she finished, the skeptical glances had been replaced with nods of respect. James, watching from the corner, felt a quiet satisfaction. He hadn't given Rachel charity. He had opened a door, and she had walked through it with undeniable strength. That evening, when Rachel returned to the house, Emma greeted her at the door with the boundless enthusiasm only a child could carry. "Did you get the job? Did you?" Rachel knelt, her eyes misting as she nodded. "I did, sweetheart." Emma threw her arms around her, nearly knocking the tired breath from Rachel's chest. James watched from the background, something warm stirring in him at the sight. Over the next few weeks, Rachel's life began to steady. She found a small apartment not far from James's home, modest but hers. She filled it with secondhand furniture, a kettle for tea, and a framed photo Emma had drawn for her, a stick-figure family beneath a snowman. And yet, despite the new apartment, Rachel spent much of her free time back at James's house. Emma begged for movie nights, for snowball fights in the yard, for evenings by the fire with all three of them together. Rachel came willingly, her laughter joining theirs until the walls of James's home seemed brighter than they had in years. One night, after Rachel had helped Emma upstairs to bed, James found himself lingering by the fireplace with her. The quiet between them was different now, layered with unspoken gratitude, respect, and something deeper neither dared name yet. "You've done more than you realize," he said, his voice low. "Not just for yourself. For Emma. For me too." Rachel shook her head, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "All I did was accept kindness." "Sometimes that's the hardest thing," James replied. Rachel's eyes softened, and though neither spoke further, the silence that lingered carried more weight than words. Winter lingered long into the new year, and snow still blanketed the ground like a second skin over the city. James stood by the large window in his living room, a mug of coffee warming his hands, as his gaze fell on the backyard. There, framed against the pale sky and the falling flakes, Emma and Rachel were building a snowman. Emma's laughter rang out, high and bright, as she packed snow into lopsided spheres with all the energy her small arms could muster. Rachel knelt beside her, smoothing the edges with patient hands, her own smile widening as Emma insisted the snowman needed the biggest button eyes in the world. The two of them were dusted with snow, their cheeks flushed red, their hair damp from melted flakes. James felt something stir in him that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, an ease that came not from distraction, but from genuine peace. Watching them together, he realized that Rachel had become more than a guest, more than even a friend. She had slipped into their lives like a missing piece they hadn't known they were searching for. "Daddy," Emma's voice called out suddenly, cutting through his thoughts. She waved from the yard, mittened hand raised high. "Come see. He's almost finished." James chuckled, setting down his mug before pulling on his coat and stepping outside. The cold nipped at his face, but the warmth of their smiles erased any chill. The snowman stood proudly, slightly uneven, with a crooked grin Emma had insisted on, but it radiated the joy of their effort. "Isn't he perfect?" Emma asked, bouncing on her toes. "He's perfect," James agreed, though his eyes lingered on Rachel. She met his gaze for a fleeting moment, and something unspoken passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had come since that night on the bench. Emma, oblivious to the pause, wrapped her arms around both of them, her small voice brimming with certainty. "Daddy, isn't it wonderful how helping Rachel helped us too?" James's throat tightened. He crouched to meet his daughter's eyes, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, you're right. Helping others often gives us gifts we never expected." Rachel stood silently, her eyes glistening. She looked at Emma as though the child's words had given her permission to believe something she had long forgotten, that she wasn't a burden, but a blessing. The three of them stayed outside until the light began to fade, their laughter mingling with the crisp winter air. Later, back inside, they shed their coats and crowded near the fireplace once more. The flames flickered across their faces, and James felt the certainty settle in his chest. What had begun as a single act of compassion had become the foundation of something enduring. Family, he realized, wasn't always formed by blood. Sometimes it was born in moments of grace. When a little girl refused to look away, when a father listened to the memory of his late wife's teachings, when a stranger accepted the fragile gift of kindness. As the snow continued to fall outside, James looked at Rachel and Emma curled together on the rug, and he knew their home had found its warmth again, not just from fire, but from love.